Welcome to the 28th Subcommittee on International Human Rights meeting. This is our 28th meeting, and today we have this meeting takes place in hybrid format. So in particular, I want to welcome Arif Virani, MP, to our committee. Welcome. The regular members are all here, but I believe you're subbing in, so welcome. I just wanted to make a few comments about how the meeting is run. So I'll recognize you by name, then you have the floor. Just wanted to note that there is simultaneous translation. You can access that. There's a little globe at the bottom of your screen where it says interpretation. You can access that and click on the language of your choice. Just remember to speak clearly and slowly so that that translation can indeed happen. Just a reminder as well to address your comments to the chair, and we have already gone through our sound checks for this meeting. This study is taking place pursuant to the order of 1082 that we resume our study on the Chinese government's residential boarding schools and preschools in the Tibet Autonomous Regions and the all Tibet Autonomous areas and countries. And so it's our pleasure to welcome you all to our committee hearings today. With us today, we have the Canada Tibet Committee, the Canada Action Institute, Tibet Watch, and the Tashi Lhunpo Monastery. And so we're going to hear from each of these organizations and groups today. There will be 5 minutes given to each group for opening statements. Interestingly, today we have an organization that will be speaking to us in a language not English or French, and so we will be giving 5 minutes to the monastery to speak in Tibetan, and then there will be a 5 minutes. It will be translated into English by an interpreter that is sitting in the room with us. So it'll be a little different than normal, perhaps, but I'm sure we will be able to manage that. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to the Tashi Lhunpo Monastery and their representatives, and then we will go through for 5 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes of translation of their statement, and then we'll go to the next witnesses for 5 minutes each after that. So the floor is yours with the monastery.
Sangmala Tashi Dele, Nge Diring, Danza Tashi Limbu, Kembe Mingdo Ne, Zamlin Nang, Pegu Nang Denla, Tessim Shunkenda, Dromi, Top Down, Chede Ramugi, Top Down, Chive, Rangwan, Top Down Sola, Zigur Shunkenda, Labar Peda, Himalaya, Zor Chibe, Kunzi Pension Rimbuche, Teba Shunkingi, Jedangba, Kyo Saya Mangbu, Sub Shude, Kennedy, Sishungla, Zadaki, Redun Kaji, Nisan Shuguin.
Tashdele, everyone. As the abbot of Tashi Lhunpo Monastery, I would like to take this opportunity today to make some fervent appeals to the Canadian government on behalf of the followers of Tibetan Buddhism around the world, human rights, religious freedom, and child rights advocates, as well as the millions of disciples of His Holiness the Panchen Rinpoche, more well known as the Panchen Lama, across Tibet and the Himalayan region.
Tacha Gyana Mabu Sishungi Tselegewe Tamjao. Pönangi Nedangla Nireshi Hajang Tabdu da Zada Cheru Droshin Yu, Pönangi Pumitsu, Droami, Topdang da Chede Rangmugi, Topdang, Chive Topdang so Mebadang, Pönang Yana Shung da Samzu Mitumbe, Pumitsu, Gangjung do Zinsun Zunju Chene, Garson Chamen do Jogi Yob Sogi, Nedun Tsapchin Lashin Yu, Tirindir Nge Pö Mimangi, Teba Shuyugi, Lachinshi, Garson Chamen do Gurwe Gorgi, Nedun da Tene, Pödun Shudu Jaguin.
Currently, we see the Chinese government undertaking ruthless and restrictive policies in Tibet. The situation is worsening day by day. We see human rights being trampled, religious freedom and rights of child being denied. Those Tibetans who disagree with the Chinese government are being arbitrarily detained, with many being disappeared. Today, I'd like to explain the situation in Tibet, the context of the disappearance of an eminent spiritual leader, namely His Holiness the 11th Panchen Lama.
대양 칠로 직동 국제 개주 겨굴로 표준 시거절 벽이 라진 베진 군진 주버 침부초 로브르도 공부 조바당 직동 국제 구조공 다왕압의 새 집신이 공사 겸군 침부초네 강기 den서자 실험부당 폐매망기 원대시 폐낙줄 하리 정도 총배 견딘 책임이 맞죠 ngasoy kyawa yepse namni ki penchun yangsi ngunjin shure so lalob ki dewe kongden lu gyu to chocho ki lusoy shizar shade penchen rinpoche kunjin chube yangsi du chume ngunjin seda nangware.
In 1989, the 10th Panchen Lama died suddenly and mysteriously while in the town of Shugotse in Tibet. Subsequently, as per Tibetan Buddhist Convention, His Holiness the Dalai Lama announced on May 14, 1995, his recognition of Gendun Chukyi Nyima from Nakchu in Tibet as the unmistaken reincarnation. Sadly, 3 days after the announcement on May 17, 1995, the Chinese authorities detained the less than 6 years old Gendun Chukyi Nyima, his parents, and entourage. They have not been seen since then, and 28 years have passed. To make matters worse, later in 1995, the Chinese government interfered in our religious process and forcefully appointed a child by the name of Gyaltsen Nobo as a fake 11th Panchen Lama. Since then, he has been used as a political tool by the Chinese government.
Chidung Gubjo Konga Tawanga Tse Chubdingi, Kanashungi, Konglo Chule Masumbe, Benching, Kuntin Chukiba, Kendi Chuki, Machoda, Kongi, Yavion Koko the Cheba, Sendiche, the Taber, Meloni Shutsabgeri, Kason Chame de Kyoga, Tang, Mase, Chidung Gubjo Kongalor, Kanashungi, Rangsam Supegi, Masu, Chulu Ledula, Kanjun Tiju, the Kenzen Nubusebe, Tugushi, Wanyugi, Benching Kuntin Chukiba, Junsuche, the Tilakune, to Tatang, Kobatsu Chapsiki, Lacher Pechu, Tang the Tangshi. Quincy pension kuntin chuba chimbe pyogi chedan rishun tola pyoyanangdo yidu chidun so zede kule cheme kyomba tar kusoya tiichedo lodong zeyo pension kuntin chukjiba chimbo choni pension kuntin chube kongshi labchen drugoba mangda yobe tone kyang hajangi kene chimbo chayo la tabar Quincy pension rinpoche neden tola bezun nangkyang longo nyege ring gangdo yomen so bangda kongze denba shik chikyang chungme dab tadung ngale la Canada Shungjoni, Bezun Nangro Shuguin, Terre Deng, a two Samsap Chimbekoni, Canada, Trozo, the Seshuna, Redu, Tensen Naji, Najinshi Shuguin.
The 10th His Holiness the Panchen Lama has worked his entire life tirelessly and even sacrificed his precious life to preserve the Tibetan language, religion, and culture across Tibet, including the 70,000 syllable report. His Holiness the 11th Panchen Lama is very crucial to continue the legacy of the 10th Panchen Lama and further realize his great works and visions. All efforts made regarding His Holiness the Panchen Lama has, for the past 28 years, have resulted to no significant proof of his whereabouts. All efforts made regarding His Holiness the Panchen Lama for the past 28 years have resulted to no significant proof of his whereabouts. Hence, we urge the Canadian government to take more concrete actions. Therefore, with great concern, we would like to make the following 5 appeals to the Canadian Parliament and Administration.
Tangbo, Canada Seshune, Melo Nishu Zabgeri, Kason Chame de Gube, Pension Rimbuchi, Kundin Chuchiba, Jizun Tenzin into Yishitin, Punzo Pes, and Buchogi, Zadagi, Neda. Shedo Yonggur, Canada Yobe, Canada Shungza Mini Pension Rimbuche, also Jete, Tuptabki Shungje Timcher, Tembe Nangtab Yong Shugyu.
1. I urge the Canadian Parliament to pass on a motion urging the Canadian government to instruct the ambassador in China to meet with the 11th Panchen Lama and ascertain his whereabouts and well-being.
Niba Canada Seshune, Pension Kundin Chuchiba. Chimbochola, Konglo Tuniche, Tabar, Milo Nishu Zabgeri, Joami, Top Down, Chede Rangmu, Chive, Top Down Sondona, Rode Chusum To, Shize Joa Miriki, Top Down Zawani Mebe, Winshe Twendagi, Sengdarik, Butabion Shugyu.
2. I urge the Canadian government to honor the 11th Panchen Lama with an award recognizing him as a victim of enforced disappearance for 28 years and as someone who has been denied with his human rights, religious freedom, rights of a child, and other fundamental rights of movement, residency, and action.
Sumba, Canada, Jozo, Quincy Pension Rimbuchi, Nurdo, Lede Yong Tapso, Chede Gabjur Chenchir, Shibi Nishu Zangani Gui, Chungardang, Nabe Chibdini, 진송기 가송 참여도 교와 속이 송지 링귀식 배낭여바 슈교.
3. In order to enable his early release and as a way to draw attention to his situation, I urge the Canadian Parliament to observe both the birthday and the day of the disappearance of the 11th Pension Lama on April 25th and May 17th, respectively.
시바 배낭 집어서 랑기 리슝 미트니 내규체도 기신기 땡자 롭다 조고베 갸나슝기 시주라 캐나다 슝니 참조 고베 자자기 구만낭고.
4. I urge the Canadian government to intervene in the forced colonial boarding schools for Tibetan children so that we can ensure the continuity of Tibetan culture.
나바 배 미망기 원데 진노 공사 겸괴 정부초 뉴르도 벨라 펩 투바당 공기 공실이 예배 님의 우멜람기 배든 시주라 무티 갑교 낭로 시교.
5. The aspirations of the
5. Les aspirations des Tibétains sont pour que Sa Sainteté, le Dalai Lama, puisse se retourner au Tibet le plus tôt possible. Par conséquent, je demande.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm very sorry, but the translation has switched. So I'm getting French on the English channel, and I'd love to hear what that fifth point was, please.
I would attempt to speak in French, although I'm unable to. So, je m'appelle Arnold Viersen. It's the.
My name is Arnold Viersen. This is the English channel.
The problem is now.
government have been consistently supporting the Tibetan people, and so I take this opportunity to express my gratitude. This 5-point appeal I have made today are in one way also connected to the mental well-being of several million believers and connected to the democratic rights of individuals. I have firm hope that the Canadian government will consider the reality of the Tibetan situation, particularly on the issue of His Holiness the Panchen Lama, and consider my appeals positively. Thank you.
Thank you, and I would. We'll now turn the floor over to the Canadian Tibet Committee and the Executive Director from there. You'll have 5 minutes, and I'll attempt to give you a signal at the 1-minute mark. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members. I deeply appreciate this opportunity to speak with you on this important matter of Tibetan language and education. The Canada Tibet Committee is an independent, non-partisan association of Tibetans and non-Tibetans from across Canada. Founded in 1987, its mandate is to promote human rights of Tibetans living under Chinese rule. As committee members will know, the right to education is protected in both the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention on the Rights of Child. Both of these treaties explicitly guarantee that minority groups must not be denied use of their own language, either in community or otherwise. Further, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights states that individuals have rights to self-determination, including social and cultural development. Here in Canada, the federal government supports efforts by indigenous peoples to reclaim and revitalize their linguistic heritage, in part by adopting the Indigenous Language Act in 2019. In the province of Quebec, it has been more than 40 years since that children in that province be educated in the French language until the end of their secondary studies. It is also interesting to note that the government of China has adopted its regional national autonomy law, which clearly states in the Article 37 that the organs of self-government of national autonomous areas shall independently develop education for their nationalities and shall, whenever possible, use textbook in their own languages and use languages as the medium of instruction. Despite such guarantees, however, a suite of policies imposed across the whole of China by the central government under the pretext of poverty alleviation or ecological protection have reinforced the ongoing assault on the Tibetan language and cultural tradition. Such policies include various nomad relocation schemes, the school consolidation policy, and the bilingual education policy. These policies have, in effect, reduced the ability of Tibetan children to access schooling in their own language, as witnesses have explained in detail before this committee in the previous meeting. A few years ago, Global Affairs Canada funded a project to support efforts by the Tibetan exiled community in India and Nepal to deliver quality education in the Tibetan language. Notwithstanding the many differences in the broader context, the project itself provided valuable lessons about challenges faced when promoting Tibetan language in the face of different dominant language. For this reason, Canada is well placed to take the lead on this issue. Therefore, in conclusion, we wish to make the following recommendations for the committee's consideration. Number one, open a dialogue with the appropriate counterparts from the National People's Congress on the matter of minority language and education in Tibet. Number two, invite visiting parliamentarians from China to indigenous communities and to Quebec in order to share Canadian experiences regarding the protection and promotion of minority languages. Number three, support academic research aimed at identifying the impacts that resettlement and education policies in Tibet have had or might have on the vibrancy of Tibetan language and culture. Number four, encourage the Canadian Embassy in Beijing to develop Canada Fund project related to Tibetan language education, including support for Tibetan language lending libraries or training of Tibetan language teachers. And finally, number five, advocate on behalf of Tibetan human rights defenders who uphold linguistic rights. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Thurchin. That's right in the time there for sure. So we'll now move on to the senior researcher with the Tibetan Action Institute. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I would like to thank the distinguished members of the committee for this opportunity. Among all the tools of colonial dispossession wielded by European settlers against indigenous populations in North America, residential schools stand out for the scope, scale, and persistence of their impact. Under the guise of providing education, these boarding establishments removed indigenous children from their homes, erased their cultures and languages, and left a lasting legacy of multi-generational trauma that haunts indigenous communities to this day. This 19th century colonial practice is being quietly resurrected on the Tibetan plateau by the Chinese government. 2 years ago, after hearing about children being forced into state-run boarding schools in parts of eastern Tibet, my colleagues at Tibet Action Institute began investigating the matter. After months of research, they arrived at the disturbing conclusion that approximately 800,000 children, that's 78% of all Tibetan students aged 6 to 18, are living in residential boarding schools. 800,000 children. This staggering statistic does not include the more than 100,000 Tibetan children aged 4 to 6 who are believed to be in boarding preschools. In these boarding institutions, children are put through a highly politicized curriculum designed to sever their ties to their religion and culture, strip them of their mother tongue, and methodically replace their Tibetan identity with a Chinese one. The residential school system sits at the center of China's new solution to the Tibet problem. Whereas previous administrations under Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, and Deng Xiaoping balanced political repression with a degree of ethnic accommodation, toward Tibetans, Xi Jinping's China has opted for an all-out eliminationist approach. This new approach is grounded in the ultra-nationalist notion that the only route to political stability is cultural uniformity and ethnic homogeneity. In the past, Beijing believed the best way to solve the nationalities problem was to afford non-Han minorities a range of special protections and cultural accommodations. But following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Chinese public intellectuals like Ma Rong and Hu Angang began to argue that special treatment for minority communities somehow undermined Chinese nation building. They called for a highly interventionist form of party-directed cultural nationalism. What Beijing now seeks to eliminate is not just separatist ideology, but the separate identity of Tibetans. Dissent never went unpunished under Beijing, but now even difference is criminalized. Among all the features of Tibetan identity, language is what most effectively unites Tibetans across the plateau. The Tibetan language forms the bedrock of one of the great civilizations of Asia, with a written history dating back over a millennium and an oral literature that goes back even further. It is also home to the largest body of canonical Buddhist literature in the world. Of all the markers of a distinct identity, language is the central pride of the Tibetan people. For Xi Jinping's China, this is precisely why the Tibetan language must be eradicated. And what better tool for that task than the residential school system? In all schools across the plateau, Tibetan has been replaced by Mandarin Chinese as the medium of instruction. Beijing has deceptively labeled this new policy bilingual education, but there is nothing bilingual about the system. Tibetan has been demoted to second or third language status in its own native homeland. This is literally a highway to mother tongue erosion. To make it worse, China has shuttered scores of local and private schools, preemptively destroying all village-level alternatives to the consolidated boarding schools. Ironically, 2 months ago, when UN experts in Geneva grilled the Chinese delegation, Chinese officials defended the mandatory boarding policy by claiming that there were no schooling alternatives in rural Tibet. Guess what? They themselves had destroyed all those local alternatives that existed. At the same event, when asked about the use of Mandarin as the medium of instruction in Tibet, Chinese officials said that the Tibetan language doesn't have the right words for teaching math and science. This is a blatantly racist and fictitious argument. All languages, when they meet new subjects for the first time, face challenges that can be overcome. The Chinese language itself faced the same problems in the recent past, and they managed pretty well, borrowing thousands of terminology from Japanese and Russian. Tibetan has by and large solved some of this problem too. Meanwhile, the boarding system is causing a major upheaval in the social, psychological, cultural, and linguistic structures of Tibetan life. We are already seeing the early results of this colonial policy. Tibetan children below a certain age are fast becoming native Mandarin speakers, which means they can no longer converse meaningfully with their parents and not even communicate with their grandparents. In Tibet, as in many traditional societies, grandparents play a seminal role in shaping children's overall psychological development and orienting their cultural worldview. If children inherit genes from their parents, it can be said they inherit culture from their grandparents. This colonial system, I'll be concluding, thank you. This colonial system is clearly designed to stem the transmission of culture from one generation to the next. Thankfully, the world is beginning to take action and take note. 2 months ago, the UN sent a strong communication to Beijing on the issue. Yesterday, the German government officially called for an end to this system. My recommendation to the Canadian government is to publicly condemn this consolidated boarding institution and to call on the Chinese government to halt this system and allow the reopening of village-level local and private schools. I finally request the Canadian government to sanction Chinese leaders and officials responsible for this heinous policy, including the intellectual architects responsible for developing and implementing this system. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now be hearing from the senior researcher from Tibet Watch. The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you for having me. On behalf of Tibet Watch, I would like to thank all the members of the committee for your attention on this urgent matter, and to the interpreter for making this communication possible. Firstly, I must make a note on the atmosphere of fear and surveillance under which Tibetans inside Tibet live every single day. Ever since the spate of 2008 freedom protests and the self-immolations from 2009, Tibet was effectively turned into a police state. Rural villages, cities, crossroads, community halls, monasteries, border crossing areas, chat groups, and social media are all monitored by police. The Chinese Communist Party says it is for social stability. Meetings are convened to announce unilateral decisions. Tibetans inside are warned to cut off their ties with their friends and family living in exile and diaspora. Old-age people with knowledge of family history are interviewed to extract information about Tibetans living outside. Huge cash rewards are promised for reports on communication between those inside and outside, and police visit homes and warn aging parents to tell the children in exile to stop going to protest, calling for freedom in Tibet. What is oppressed at home is repressed abroad. What then is the purpose of school in an occupied country? A young refugee girl aged 15 who recently escaped to India from eastern Tibet told us about her time at her minority boarding secondary school. We wake up early around 4 to 5 in the morning and start morning exercises like running in the playground, all under the close watch of surveillance cameras. The medium of instruction is mainly Chinese. Except for Tibetan language class, the rest of the subjects are taught in Chinese language. Tibetan language class is optional, and marks in the Tibetan exam are not even counted in the final exam score. She belongs to the top class of students who scored highest, but they don't get the chance to visit home on weekends like others. The best teachers give them classes, but only 10 out of 50 teachers at the school are of Tibetan origin teaching Tibetan language. A couple of other newly arrived refugees from eastern Tibet also echoed the same observation, adding that naming a school Tibetan is just for the namesake, and that there is no career and scope for jobs in a market-driven society where Chinese language proficiency is the main requirement. In between this structural injustice, Tibetans have carefully and consistently carved out spaces for Tibetan education, private school, online language chat groups, and home tuition, but these spaces are also rapidly shrinking. For example, in July 2021, Sengdruk Tatsé, a school founded with government permission, was forcibly shut down without any official clarification. Its students were then enrolled into local state-run schools, whilst orphans without fixed domiciliation faced many difficulties. A Tibetan teacher at the school was deeply disturbed by the closure and unable to eat, but she was detained. The same year, Gyalten Geza, another renowned Tibetan school, was ordered to change the curriculum and medium of instruction in Chinese, take all exams in Chinese, or face shutdown. Then came the replacement of Tibetan textbooks with that of Chinese. Parents in Darlak Township in Golok were told that from September 2021 onwards, all their children must go to school only with the newly introduced textbooks in Chinese. Two youngsters expressed concerns about the future impact of this decision in an online chat group, but they were both detained. Another teenager in Ngaba County was also taken into custody after he submitted a petition against the Chinese medium of instruction and refused to join a propaganda meeting about praising the CCP. Shortly after the schools opened in September 2021, in Markham County, 3 children aged 11, 15, and 16 who expressed unhappiness about the lack of Tibetan classes were arrested from their boarding school and taken to a so-called Reform Through Education Center under the pretext of needing psychological counseling. The Chinese government also issued 2 other notices in 2021, promoting Mandarin Chinese as the national common language in preschool kindergartens and to reduce the burden of homework and off-campus tuition. But this double reduction, so to speak, means that off-campus tuitions in Tibetan language or any other subjects by Tibetans face scrutiny and closure. The boarding school is also deeply intertwined with state policies that displace nomads from their ancestral lands, known in Tibet Autonomous Region as Extremely High Altitude Ecological Resettlement Program. By 2025, entire villages in their hundreds are going to be moved hundreds of kilometers away. The consequences are parents lose their traditional and sustainable livelihoods, and even if their children, their boarding school, have also been moved to the same new area, parents no longer have their homeland to live in and pass on their ancestral knowledge of the land. This is how the Chinese Communist Party, to use their jargon, give full play to the children of Tibet. Their mother tongue is systematically devalued to nothing more than a language subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to our questioning. This is a 7-minute round, so each member will have 7 minutes to ask questions. I will turn the floor over to Saeed Abutab.
Well, thank you, and thanks for appearing today for committee. It's very obvious that the Chinese regime and government is trying to use schooling to be able to impact changes on the culture of Tibet region and Tibetan in general. Since 2008, these forced boarding schools have been running, and they could probably be running from before that. In your assessment, and the question I would like to start with Mr. Thurchin, in your own assessment, how much of an impact have these boarding schools have left on the culture, on the language, on the community in general? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. The impact of forcibly putting Tibetan children into residential boarding school has created an environment where Tibetan children are no longer able to communicate with their grandparents, because grandparents would speak Tibetan and children would not be able to speak in Tibetan. It has cut off the link of sharing not just the language, but also sharing the history of that grandparents would usually share to their grandchildren. That is just one example. But I would differ to our colleague at Tibet Action Institute, who has done research and spent a lot of time on this particular issue.
If I may add very quickly to what my colleague Sharabla just said, in terms of doing extensive research on the ground on exactly the scale, the scope and the scale of the impact, it's very difficult to do because the Chinese government does not allow any foreigner, any foreign researcher or scholar or independent investigators or journalists to go into Tibet. And they don't allow any information from Tibet to escape out of Tibet. In Tibet, one reason why there is an information black hole is the messengers get punished sometimes even worse than the protesters. At the same time, a couple of examples that I have observed in my own experience. The age of the child seems to be very important in terms of how deep the level of impact is. Let's say if we just look at the individual impact of one family. My colleague, Dr. Gallo, who's here with us, he observed that among children who are between the ages of 3, 4 to 5 and 6, among them, within the course of 3 to 6 months, that's long enough for a child to switch completely from Tibetan to Mandarin. And it basically literally takes less than 6 months for the language erosion to happen at a very fundamental place. I also met a young Tibetan student around the age of 11 and 12. And this was somebody who attended one of those boarding institutions recently. And her story was a little bit different because she grew up in a family that was very fiercely proud of their Tibetan heritage. She grew up speaking only Tibetan in her home, and that was the language of the home. But when she was enrolled into boarding institution at age 10, within 1 year, Mandarin displaced Tibetan as her first language. When I met her, she was no longer comfortable speaking in Tibetan. she was speaking to me in halting Tibetan, and her first language was very clearly Mandarin. And I asked her, what about the other students in your school? In class, of course, you speak Mandarin, but outside of class, what language do you use with each other, with your peers? She said Mandarin, Chinese.
On this note, how long will it be continuing doing the residential schools? How long will it take to wipe out completely the Tibet culture and language?
And that's the implication that many of us really deeply worry about, because it is one of those impact that is difficult to observe and difficult to notice, because it starts, let's imagine, in her case, students who are 11 to 12 years old right now, they already switch to Mandarin as their first language. We cannot say what's happening to people who are 16, 17, 18 years old. So it's easy for people to think that Tibetan language is still doing okay because people are still speaking Tibetan. But if we play this experiment forward, when her generation, when they get to 40 years old or 50 years old, we have a world where in Tibet, majority of the Tibetan population will be speaking in Chinese, not in Tibetan, to each other. There is nothing wrong with being bilingual, but there is something disturbing when Tibetans talk to each other in Chinese as their main language. And this is the real scenario that we are looking at, because it's a cohort effect, and it happens. Right now it's hard to notice, but when the world starts to notice, it might become too late. That's why right now is the time for action.
So between the action on doing something with the very, very stubborn regime out there that is on a power trip, basically, versus the other countering action to be able to preserve and to minimize the impact of the actions happening through as a result of residential schools. What do you think the best action can be done or can be taken to be able, as I said, to minimize the effect of what's going on?
Unfortunately, that puts us out of time there, but we will be turning over to Mr. Virani for another 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the welcome to the committee. I want to say thank you in Tujiche, especially to all of the witnesses in Tujiche, which means thank you in Tibetan to all of the witnesses, virtual and in person, who have come to share such important information. It's not lost on me as a Muslim Canadian, today is Eid al-Fitr. And as Muslim Canadians are free to celebrate with their families, as I have been doing with my family today, religious worship and religious freedom in other parts of the world, including in Tibet, is extremely restricted. And I think it just underscores the need for us to be all vigilant. So let me just start by saying that. I wanted to put out a request to the first three witnesses. I was jotting down things as fast as possible, but I think between Rinpoche La and Sherab Terchen and Tenzin Dorje, you provided about 12 different recommendations. If you could please just make sure all of those recommendations are provided in writing to the clerk and to the analyst, that would be very beneficial for us, because we do want to scrutinize those very closely. I want to start with my first question in these 7 minutes, perhaps to the Tibet Action Institute and Tenzin Dorje La. It seems to me that Tibet, given from what we've heard, is at an inflection point where Canada was maybe around the 1870s or 1880s, just when we were designing the residential school system for Indigenous kids in this country, where the overt policy of the government of Canada at the time was to take the Indian out of the child. You've said quite candidly, Tenzin La, that the PRC under Xi Jinping is deliberately attempting to assimilate Tibetans quite directly by converting to a complete usage of Mandarin. What analogies do you see between what happened in this country and unfortunately continues to this day in Canada with the Indian residential school system, where we took kids away from their Indigenous homes and put them far away places, forcing them to learn English in a foreign language, to what is happening right now in Tibet? And what lessons can we apply from our own experience to help the Tibetan cause? So if you could start with that, please, Mr. Dorje.
I think the two cases are very similar when it comes to the intent of the government, the main goal of the government, and many of the strategies that the government is using are also very similar. Some of the tactics might be a little bit different, but most of the strategies are the same, and the goal is exactly the same. The only major difference that I see is in the case of what China is doing to Tibet right now, it is not too late yet. There is time to stop it from happening. And if the phrase never again has any meaning, we have a chance to stop this genocide.
Thank you, Dojila. If I could turn to Sheriff Turchin from the CTC. Sheriff, you talked about, I mean, obviously there's a moral flaw to what the PRC is doing. There's a violation of international human rights, and you outlined some of the covenants. But it also seems that you're making the case that the Chinese government, even pursuant to their own domestic legislation, they're violating their own domestic laws, their own national laws in the PRC in terms of what they're doing to the Tibetan people. Can you just refresh us in terms of the legislation you feel is being violated domestically in terms of the PRC violating their own laws?
Yes, certainly. Thank you for the question. When it comes to the practices of any policies in Tibet by the Chinese government, the critical question remains, are they transparent? What about the actual implementation of the policies that exist only in theory? And this is where the idea of fact-finding, independent visit, unrestricted visit to Tibet and other autonomous part of China is very important. And in this regard, I would suggest the idea of reciprocity, which is in 2018, we had Chinese government appointed officials visiting and testifying before the Foreign Affairs Committee and sharing their thoughts. But we do not have the same opportunity for Canadian government officials, Canadian parliamentarians to visit Tibet and to see what is the actual situation. So to answer this question, I would suggest that the reciprocal access to Tibet is very important.
Okay, thank you, Sheriff La. And if I could turn to the abbot, Tenzin Thupten Rabgyallah, for this last question. I think it's fairly familiar to me. I mean, I'm the chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Tibet in terms of understanding the role of the Panchen Lama, but I'm not sure if it's fair or if it's crystal clear to everyone in this committee and people watching at home about the importance of the Panchen Lama vis-a-vis the succession of the Dalai Lama. My understanding is that each recognizes each other's reincarnation, and that the end strategic goal of the Chinese government is by controlling who is the Panchen Lama and effectively trying to replace the current Panchen Lama, they control who would succeed the 14th Dalai Lama, because the Panchen Lama identifies and recognizes what would be the 15th Dalai Lama. So can you just explain to viewers what is the strategic purpose that China is trying to achieve by abducting Gedin Choki Nyima, and also by trying to put someone as a replacement in his place? And thank you so much for being here, Rabgyallah.
Ta kunzi penshar mchigi nedwen di kechenpo yime di chik di ngaranzo pyoda Himalaya zobe zamlingi da mima saye mangbu ki kebiyu ki zawe lama chi tsigi yore. De zamdo mazebe ani chidang ngaranzo pyoge luksoy la ya sungyoy la ngeme ki sungsoy la ya ani namla ngima dawa sala gyawa penchen se du ani ngima da dawa dabu gyawa che dang ani penchen rinpoche ani ngima da dawa dabu ki ani pe tsidong che sa ke lama chi le tungu chi chigi yore. Ani ngiba de la ya ani chigi kunsi penchen rinpoche ki nedwen di da chig gyawa rinpoche ngi paru la ya nguyengi lugyu nang la tsumba ina pyoge ta chocho ki lugyu nang la ya ani penchun jenjung ki jawa pingya pinche ki jawa dega nang shi lalop ki lama da lome ki jawa dega nang shi ti nang ne lhawar do mikse yangsi ngunzi chigi chigla nang sui ki jawa la sope ki ani pe hajang ki kene chenpuchi chadi yores. Yela di sona.
So, His Holiness the 10th Panchen Rinpoche is very important across many millions of Buddhist followers across Tibet and Himalayan region. He serves as the root guru of many Tibetans across. And in regards to the importance of His Holiness the Panchen Rinpoche in relation to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, there's an analogy in our communities that of the sun and the moon. The sun being His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the moon being His Holiness the Panchen Lama. This is in accordance of historical tradition of both the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Darshan Lama of a relationship that's of a relational between them two as a father and a son, and or teacher-student relationship, and also very importantly being involved in recognizing each other's reincarnations.
Thank you. Thank you. That's all the time we have. I'm now going to turn the floor over to Mr. Brunel de Sepp.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You're doing a wonderful job. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here with us today. And I would like to apologize if I mispronounce your names. I will try not to mispronounce them too badly. I think that all of the witnesses have talked about the language that is at the basis of Tibetan culture and Buddhism, of course. And so I think that as a Quebecer, I can understand that very well. But there are some unfortunate examples. There are some provinces in Canada that have forbidden education in French in Quebec, in Manitoba, and for example, in 1970, in Manitoba, at the time, there were as many French speakers as English speakers. And when it came to providing education in French, well, we know that things developed the way they have without French language education. So that is what happens when there is forced education in a different language. It has an impact over generations. So I would like to have a question for Mr. Dorji, because we have to use the past to see what the future holds, and we have to look at Canada's example and see what may happen in Tibet based on that example.
Est-ce que je dois recommencer, Monsieur le Président?
Should I start over, Mr. Chair? Was there a problem with getting the interpretation through?
The last part I missed in the translation a little bit, I think.
Okay.
The last part of the question.
All right, Mr. Brunel de Sepp, I'll give you another minute to repeat your question.
Okay. Je vais juste
Very good. So I'll start over, because there were some examples of assimilation of Francophones in Canadian provinces after the suppression of French language education in Manitoba, for example. And so those are examples that could perhaps be used to show what could happen in Tibet with the schools there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think there is no words to stress the importance of language to an individual, to a society, to a people, to a family. And sometimes I think we make a mistake when we think of language as a tool for communication between two people or between two societies. Language is much more than a tool. It's the foundation for being a human being. In some ways, it is what distinguishes us from all the others, right, as humans. And language is basically a way of thinking. It's a way of being in the world. And I was just speaking this morning with Dr. Gallo about the importance, what it means to lose a language. When somebody loses their language, it's not the same as losing many other things that are important to a person. When you lose a language, the person who loses their mother tongue does not always gain another language at the same level. Usually they gain half a language. Usually they gain an incomplete language. And there are people who argue, there is literature that says language basically determines thought, right? It determines our characteristics, personalities. It influences who we are, even at that level. Then when we talk about losing a language, it is not only a traumatic loss for an individual. It's not only a traumatic loss for a nation. It's not only a loss for society or the relationships people have. We lose so much more that cannot be expressed enough through words. And I think that is the future that we are looking at if we fail, if the world fails to notice the alarming situation right now, if we fail to respond to this alarm that the situation is right now. Thank you.
Merci infiniment pour ça, je pense.
Thank you for that. I believe that language is at the basis of how a person thinks, and that's why we may think differently based on our mother tongue. I believe that this is supported by a number of sociologists, in fact. Oh, I have a question now for my friend Churchin from the Canada-Tibet community. Are you taking a risk when you defend Tibet here, when we hear about Chinese interference here in Canada? Is it difficult for you to do this? Do you feel safe in Canada when you defend Tibetans here and you defend the Tibetans that are at home?
Thank you for the question. I think the threat is mainly applicable to Tibetans who still have families in Tibet, which is what Chinese government often uses to coerce, to self-censor Tibetans living in exile. And I didn't really have much fear when I joined Tibet advocacy, when I started speaking out for human rights in Tibet in Canada. But in recent time, after hearing about more stories about Chinese influence and interferences in Canada, and especially after hearing the stories of how the existence of Chinese police stations in Canada, it really gave me a sense of fear, whether I'm safe or not. So this is something that I've never felt until 2 years ago. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Une minute.
Thank you very much. I have a minute left. Very quickly, Your Holiness Rinpoche, I would like to ask you, do you think that the parliamentarians at the House of Commons should support your 5 recommendations? And if we do you think that Canada will become an example throughout the world and other democratic countries could perhaps follow suit?
Chak tuya gire wa chimbu dus kain sana penjerum je tabu cha sha nang ran zu gong du shu ba nang shi ge wo sa ya mang be ki u ti ni ba tabu je la chu cho gi mun ji shu ye ji den de ji song zang di to ne mi mang la ko do pe ya da de ga nang shi gi to ne mang bu ji li ya ani ji di gi to ne penjerum je ne ga ji zam chimbu yu me di chen tu ya da di to ne ani gyab gyo re re gu re kan ji to li ya ani pu sun so ba ne bu ji yong tu sa re sa be re wa chimbu yu.
Yes, Canada would be a leader should the Parliament support the 5 appeals. We have big hope in Canada leading that conversation because millions of followers of His Holiness the Panchen Rinpoche, who is namely the 2nd highest Buddhist leader, this action by the Canadian government will support in raising awareness about His Holiness the Panchen Rinpoche and extremely help. And not only will it help, we have high hopes that Canada will take lead on this.
Thank you. We'll now go to MP Pearson.
Thank you very much,
Merci.
Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of the witnesses for coming and sharing this very difficult testimony. And similar to my colleague from the Liberal Party, and I should say Eid Mubarak, I also see the commonalities with the residential system that we've seen in Canada and how it seems like the same tools have been used to destroy the Tibetan people. Obviously, extremely upsetting. His Holiness just spoke a little bit about wanting Canada to take a leadership role in this. And I'd like to ask all three witnesses if they could comment on what other countries have said, what other countries have been doing with regards to support. I'd just like to get a sense of where that situation is. I know that it is always best if we can work with when dealing with the PRC, that it's always best if we can work with our allies, if we can work with other like-minded countries, as a bloc. It is an easier and more effective way of us doing that work. I'm just wondering where other countries are at, if there are any that have been leading on this, any that have been doing really good work that we can look to. Perhaps I'll start with His Holiness, and then if the other two witnesses would like to jump in.
나서다 군지 벤처를 미치기 내던 총을 차샤바이나 다 아리제 대가나 있는 저기 톤 총에 아리제 대가나시 캐나다제 대가나시 유럽제 아니 갸가제 당주 지 단다 소소기 강 자사기 롱바 망체벌 자사기 롱바 창매기 아니 갸교 당 할레바 유에데버든지 차대샤스.
In short, wherever I've been able to visit, in terms of whether it is the United States, here in Canada, across Europe, in India, in London, where I'm about to go, wherever I've been, we've seen immense support in regards to His Holiness the Panchen Rinpoche's case.
Thank you. I would say, there are certainly many other countries who have taken strong position on the issue of not just the human rights, but the political issue of Tibet as well. I would cite the example of the bills that were passed in the U.S. In the recent years. Reciprocal access to Tibet was passed in the U.S. Tibet Policy and Security Act was passed in the U.S. And currently there's a bill on resolving the Sino-Tibetan conflict, which is also under consideration for passing in the U.S. Congress. And more at the multilateral platform, I wanted to bring this example. I think it was about a little more than a year ago, when Canada's UN Ambassador Bob Rae mentioned, in response to a question asked by Chinese representative there, that Canada actually recognizes the acknowledgement and the reconciliation of its history with indigenous peoples. And this happens whenever there's any international attempt to point out China's treatment of its national people, whether it's Tibetans, Uyghurs, or Mongolians. So China often uses this as a counterattack to point out as Western government, reminding about their own history. And this is where Bob Rae's answer, I thought, was a really good answer.
Mr. Dorji, anything from you?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add also that 2 months ago, the United Nations released a very strong statement on this subject, demanding that the Chinese government should abolish the entire colonial system of boarding schools in Tibet. And just yesterday, actually, the German government from the Foreign Office took a stand and made a call, very strong call to the Chinese government directly, that they should close down the colonial boarding school system as well.
Thank you. Mr. Dorji, how would you evaluate Canada's response to date? How do you feel that Canada is doing? I know that you've brought forward many recommendations that we can review, but how do you feel to date that Canada has done?
I think the fact that we're having this meeting is a recognition of Canada's active interest on this issue. And the fact that we recently had on December 14 unanimously passed a motion supporting the resumption of Sino-Tibetan dialogue is a sign that Canada has shown an increasing interest in resolving the human rights issues, in resolving the Sino-Tibetan conflict. And I hope there will be more interest. I hope this is just a start. I
also feel that the response from the Canadian Parliament so far has been very encouraging to us. The fact that we are holding this hearing, the Tibetan people are following this event, and we can assure you that people inside Tibet who really have no voice because they are being crushed by the Chinese government, people also from Tibet are following what the Canadian government and the Parliament has been, governments around the world are taking action on this. And I believe that the Canadian government could go much further than currently, and in fact take a much stronger stand from the government side, release statement from the highest levels of government, and make strong calls to the Chinese government on closing down this institution, especially because of our own history out here in North America. I think this history, actually, the colonial history of what happened in Canada, places the Canadian government in an ironically, paradoxically, very, very powerful position of taking action on this issue.
Thank you very much. I believe I'm almost out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I just was going to go around the room here, canvass the MPs. Do you want to do another round? I know that we have an hour of committee business coming up right after this. I guess I would look for a motion perhaps to do one more round. Would that
So
be the will?
Yes.
Yes. All right. So we'll do one more
Mr. Chair-
round.
Mr.
Five.
Mr. Chair, just on an administrative point, if Mr. Dorje could provide to the committee the two statements that he mentioned to Ms. McPherson, so he mentioned a German government position and a UN report, I think that might be helpful for our analysis. Thanks,
For
Mr.
sure. For sure. So we'll go to our second round. These will be 5-minute rounds of questioning. And first on the list, I have MP Anita Vanderbilt.
Okay, Mr. Chair, does this mean we will not have a second question for our side? Because if that's the case, I'll probably split my time with Ali.
Yeah, my understanding would be that we just do one more round.
This is it. Okay. So
yeah.
I'll split my time with Ali. So I'll try to be very quick, but I first want to say that some of the things that you've testified today, particularly, the specter that we will have a generation that will lose their language and culture if we don't take action now, and also the idea that children can't speak to their own grandparents, I think for every one of us here is absolutely both heartbreaking, but also inspires anger and action. So thank you very much for testifying. And I just have a quick question then for Mr. Cherkin. You mentioned a couple of things. First of all, you mentioned human rights defenders and the need for Canada to do more to help the human rights defenders that need to come here. We have, through this committee, created and first proposed, and now the government has created 250 spots for human rights defenders annually to be able to come to Canada. Do you think that this is something that we should expand and increase and allow globally, but also for Tibetans, more human rights defenders as a unique stream of immigration, not as refugees or as immigrants, but specifically so they can come, and then if they need to return or stay here, it would be flexible?
Thank you for the question. Certainly, and I would say that the invitation, if there's a scope for expansion of the committee, invitation should be sent to Tibetan human rights defenders from inside Tibet. And I think many committee members would know the story of Tibetan language advocate Tashi Wangchuk, who was sentenced to 5 years in prisons just for advocating, just for speaking about the preservation and promotion of Tibetan language to New York Times reporter. And Canadian government has issued statement for the immediate and unconditional release of Tashi Wangchuk in past. We have communicated with Canadian officials in embassy in Beijing, and we're thankful that the embassy sent its official to try to get inside the court when there was sentencing. The hearing about his sentencing was about to happen. But unfortunately, and not surprisingly, Canadian officials as well as officials from other countries were not allowed to get inside the court to hear about the details. And this is usually quite common to many Tibetans, which is something that I've spoken in my previous testimony at the Foreign Affairs Committee, where many Tibetan who are prisoner of political conscience do not have the rights to access to lawyers, do not have the rights to access to their families when they are detained. Thank you.
I think those are very important recommendations. Just a flip side about the human rights defenders that are still in Tibet is those that are here, those of you who are here today. Mr. Chechen, you said something about that there's been a change in the last couple of years. And I wonder if there would be a need, if you think there would be a need for the federal government, maybe within the RCMP, to create some kind of a protective service, maybe a public person's protective service for people who are targeted specifically because of their activism. Is that something that you would, and I'll ask for a very quick answer so I have some time for Mr. Assassi to ask.
Thank you for this very important question. I think the best person to really answer this question would be my colleague who's actually sitting here today, because Chimi Lhamo has actually been the victim of, yes, please, Chimi.
Yes, to keep it short, but there's also a report by Amnesty International that has been presented multiple times. I've personally testified here more than twice with the recommendations. And the first recommendation, that's the low-hanging fruit, is a point person to be able to direct resources or connect us to individuals that could support us, because we've always gone round and round and round and never really had the support. And my case was presented in 2019.
Mm-hmm. We'll remember that for our recommendations. Mr. Assassi, I don't know if there's time left, but go ahead, please.
I think I have 30 seconds. Thank you, Ms. Vandenbelt. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll jump right in, and I will preface it by saying, as Canadians, we obviously understand the significance of language and identity. I wanted to ask Mr. Turchin about the GAC funding that was made available. You touched on it. Can you tell us about the significance of that and whether there is more funding that is required going forward for preserving the Tibetan language?
As I mentioned in my opening remark, GAC has funded this, as far as my knowledge is concerned. This is the second project that has been funded in the last 6 years. And the project is still going on. The project deals with helping Tibetan schools in India and Nepal, covering over 76 Tibetan schools, offering them opportunity to learn in their own Tibetan language. And we're talking about Tibetans in exile. And this presents, as I mentioned in opening, this presents an opportunity to show to Chinese government that Tibetans, if given an opportunity, could succeed. And the Tibetan language, as my colleague from Tibet Action Institute mentioned, that Tibetan as a language has all the qualities to succeed in whatever aspirations ones have. And the Central Tibetan Administration have requested Canadian government for continuation of this funding. And I would appeal to this committee for the continuation of funding to Tibetan schools in India and Nepal.
Thank you. We'll now move to MP Abutaf for 5 minutes.
Thank you. The Chinese government have signed into the United Nations Declaration or Convention, Article 26 on education and the parents' right to choose the kind of education that should be given to their children. So what is going on here? The Chinese government now doing the opposite. I would like to know from you whether there is a pressure on from United Nations on Chinese government to fulfill this signatory commitment, and follow to that. I would like you, if you don't mind, to touch on the role of the religious institutions in fulfilling the agenda of the Chinese government regarding Tibet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. the Chinese government has been responding to the world starting to criticize the institution of colonial boarding schools. And we have noticed after the United Nations sent a communication to Beijing, after seeing news of hearings being held in US Congress and now in the Canadian Parliament, the Chinese government is really taking this issue seriously. And contrary to the conventional wisdom, the wrong conventional wisdom that Chinese government doesn't care about what the world thinks, nothing will move Beijing, they are too powerful, they won't budge. Contrary to all that, Beijing actually cares a lot, and they have been responding from the highest levels, writing in their own media channels about this issue and trying to fight us back. And that's why they're trying to come up with all these fictitious arguments about why Tibetans should be in boarding schools, why Tibetan language is not adequate for learning math and science. And I think if there is continued building of more pressure from the world, from governments, from various organizations, I think it is possible for the Chinese government to budge and to change its behavior and to change its policy. And we've been hearing whispers that in some small places, in some counties in Tibet, there seem to be new changes on the ground. Some reversal of policies that are not written, that are not completely official yet, but some adaptation and changes happening on the ground. And we see these as signs that actually, if the world takes action, we can actually change China's behavior.
Terrific. On the second question, if Mr. Rabiagal can advise us on this. I think that's a very important question to know what the role of the religious institutions on fulfilling the agenda of the Chinese government.
Tadizo Chidang Tanda Kunsi Penjer Mujene the Dev Chana Shibaina, any Kunsi Penjer Muje Kundi Juba Tabudi, any Tangajungagu to you Jelia, any Chigi Coach Chogo Toma Chej Nang Nidi, any Chigi Pearl Chashavina, that Kunsi Penjer Mujukundi Chubeki Kuleshira Kyonyoris, and Mazebeki, any Jig Lobda Sanzu Nayata, the Hanangashi, any Jigi. Chulu sosogi rangi ni chigi gyuba minyamba gyunzi cheya oda dendre ki thola halebe ki kunse penjerim buchi ki thol shoji na yore masebe ki thol ya ani thongmar chigi tim ki timlu zanji swe nangi di ani kunse penjerim buchi kunde chube ki phenang la ani de la len ta na ya da ani lobda la su ki pheje nang ko ya la soba din zoi thol ya ani chigi kunse kunde chube ki ani kule ta kongshi da chashi na masona shoji la len dumshi na masona so nangyo di ta kunjin chuba anu she ma shube ken samne ani phenang ya di thol ya halebe ki nyamnga sene masona kangi chimbuchi chedi yoris.
In relation to His Holiness the Panchen Rinpoche, post-1959, His Holiness the 10th Panchen Rinpoche had worked tirelessly for the continuation of various religious institutions, but also had worked tirelessly for the spread of education, preservation of our Tibetan culture, and the education system. So his contributions are insurmountable. And since his passing, the impact on the Tibetan community in the Tibetans has been terrible, and that is the impact of His Holiness the Panchen Rinpoche 10th reincarnation. And if I may just add, in his statement earlier, he did mention that His Holiness the 10th Panchen Rinpoche had passed away suddenly and mysteriously. Right after that, there has been the 11th Panchen Lama, this Gendun Chökyi Nyima, who was 6 years old when he was kidnapped and abducted, and so that clearly shows the amount to how far the Chinese government can go when there are religious institutions that pose a threat to them.
군세 rinpoche tunga니까 까나 요래 제상 공서초대 폐체 전조리야 폐체 최대리 슝기 돌 할레베게 우티 난제 굴레균 안다가나시 별이야 되디 벤처럼지 슈여베이나 아니 최대리 슝기의 제베돌 할레베 투겐시야다 고급 시부지 요래데 다 방어제 질라 아니 군세 rinpoche 도부 로보다 신시하고 디기 아니 배 경공다 경규다 다지로 투팡부 참여 중수시제 공수 쪽에 간낭 받는 중요하레스.
His Holiness the Dalai Lama has also publicly expressed his deep sadness for the passing of the 10th Panchen Rinpoche, because should the 10th Panchen Rinpoche still be alive, or the 11th Panchen Rinpoche still be here and known to the world, the impact on the Tibetan community would have been insurmountable. And hence, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has also publicly spoken about how impactful His Holiness the 10th Panchen Rinpoche has been, and how important it is for us to find the 11th one.
Okay, thank you. And now I'll hear from MP Brunel de Sepp. 5 minutes.
Pardon, excusez.
Sorry about that. I had a bit of a microphone problem. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Dorji, so in the residential schools, it is impossible to get an education in Tibetan or to have religious customs transmitted. But how about a political indoctrination on the part of the Chinese government toward children in those residential schools?
That's a really important question. In the place of religious and cultural education, not only are Tibetan children not getting the kind of education that is relevant to their own culture and their own history, their own worldview, Tibetan children are actually being a very politicized, extremely strong propagandistic version of the Chinese Communist Party's worldview to these children. And the shocking thing is, it starts very early. They don't even spare children. They don't even wait until children are 10 years or 15 years old. Kids who are 4, 5, 6 years old, they are already being bombarded with this type of propagandistic, politicized indoctrination. And basically, while removing what makes a child Tibetan, which is their family's cultural, local, scientific, natural kind of ecological way of being in the world, not only the language, the psychological orientation to this world, while taking out all of those things, in that empty vessel, they are filling it in with political indoctrination about how great the Chinese Communist Party is, how terrible the Japanese occupiers, the Japanese soldiers are. And basically, like that's just one example. And I've seen some of these textbooks with images that are extremely violent, extremely disturbing, extremely bloody, extremely gory. And that's the kind of books that are used to teach very young children starting from 5 or 6 years old. So that is the reality of the type of indoctrination and political education that they are getting.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Yes, so Ms. Choi Kee, I have a question for you. You may know that myself and some of my colleagues here are banned from entering China. We cannot go to China for political reasons. But when we attack the political system in China, as we did for Uyghur rights, for example, when we talk about Tibetans, etc., we in turn are attacked and we are told that we are being racist and anti-Chinese. So I think that that's sort of Beijing's propaganda that is used here in the political space. And so I wonder, what do you think the impact of that propaganda is, and how do we avoid falling into that trap? Thank you, Mr. Brunel, for your question. It is about Tibetans and many others that have been oppressed for years. I think that it is important to stay confident, to know that we are defending the right cause, the cause of truth, and that there can be no freedom in an occupied country. So we have been under Chinese occupation, and really the values that are precious to us in democratic countries must be upheld. So even though on the surface the arguments against you can seem quite dangerous, we know that deep down we are defending values that are precious, and so are you. Thank you very much. Do I have some time left, Mr. Chair? Very quickly then, Mr. Dorji, in October 2020, in Foreign Policy magazine, you wrote an article in which you underlined the democratic promotion tools that had some success in other places, failed in Beijing because of the surveillance within China. And so how does China use data and surveillance to oppress the Tibetan minority?
Very quickly.
Thank you. The Chinese government has been very effective and rather successful at mobilizing big data totalitarianism and various transnational tools of tyranny to silence Tibetans abroad in the world and also to repress Tibetans inside Tibet. And one key way that they use to achieve this is by linking Tibetans living in the diaspora to their family members in Tibet. And by using that linkage and using that relationship, they use family members who are in Tibet as the hostage, and they're quite blatant about it. And I know a lot of Tibetans who are Tibetan Americans or Tibetan Canadians who've traveled to Tibet, and they get told by this United Front minders explicitly and directly, you guys live out there in freedom, in the free world. But if you say anything critical of the Chinese government, just remember your family is right here under our thumb. And that's the explicit kind of threat that's, through which China is using a strategy to silence the world. Within Tibet, there has been cases where DNA collection without consent has been taking place in schools, various communities, and there is still a lot of question about exactly what the Chinese government is trying to do with this, but it's nothing benign, it's nothing good that's ever going to come out of this. So we do live in a very scary time when the world could go in a very different place, and China is at the cutting edge, leading in the frontier of how technologies are being mobilized to increase tyranny. And the dream that we had 20 years ago that the internet would liberate humanity, would bring democracy, how technologies of liberation would help us. Instead, the Chinese government is playing a huge role in inverting this whole logic. And right now, that's another reason why we have to be really careful and hold corporations, especially multinational corporations that are out here in the West, that are benefiting from our democracy, that are benefiting from our freedom, but at the same time, they are aiding, giving their software and aiding the Chinese government impose its tyranny, not only in China, but also abroad. And we have to hold these corporations accountable as well.
Merci infiniment. Merci infiniment.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of the witnesses.
Now I'll have 5 minutes from MP McPherson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you again to the witnesses. You know, I'm very interested in that last question, and I think the chair had asked for a bit of a brief answer, but I'd like to explore that a little bit further. I actually just returned from Taiwan, and I saw there, you know, what the Taiwanese are having to deal with regards to misinformation and disinformation campaigns, with regards to the cyber attacks that they are receiving, you know, up to 1 million a day that are happening. We also know that the suppression of human rights with regards to the Uyghurs, you know, in Hong Kong, all of those things are part of this bigger picture of how we're seeing the PRC become increasingly belligerent. I'm one of the members, like Mr. Brunel Duceppe, who has been banned from visiting China. I'd like to hear from all of the witnesses about, you know, more information about how the PRC is hiding the human rights abuses that it's perpetrating, how it's silencing Tibetans, how it's using the online tools to suppress information. If I could start as well with our guest from Tibet Watch, we haven't had an opportunity to hear from her quite as much. So, Ms. Choki, if I could start with you.
Sure. Thank you for this very important question. It's all by design how they hide deliberately and intentionally, by all means, by using technology, by having people monitor online chat groups as well. We have received reports of Tibetans who post just Al-Hakarsan, Happy White Wednesday, which is like a decentralized movement of celebrating Tibetan identity on the sole day of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We have people getting arrested for simple messages like that online. So there are people monitoring online communication. We have huge cash rewards for people who report to the police knowledge about Tibetans who have contacts with Tibetans living outside. Cash rewards also for monitoring people crossing the border areas, as a result of which, after 2008, there is just a trickle of Tibetan refugees being able to escape to Nepal. And then there are also CCP members in the monasteries. You know, monasteries are learning centers where the whole pursuit of education is liberation from suffering, and not just for oneself, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. But then since 2012, there are monastic management committees in monasteries where Chinese Communist Party members who are atheist permanently in there to monitor and oversee, supervise all the activities of the monks. We have case studies of how there are police stations constructed right next to a monastery in Changu County, for example. So chat groups monitored, online communication monitored, online posts on the individual social accounts monitored, live streaming is monitored as well. We have information of Tibetan musicians stopping themselves from speaking in Tibetan because their live streaming will be shut down. I also have an evidence of a Tibetan mother and a children talking to each other on a live streaming, and this little boy who is just scribbling figures repetitively like any child would, and just innocently asking his mom, if I speak in Tibetan in Douyin, which is like a video sharing platform, they say that they will shut down our account. So I don't know whether I should speak in Tibetan or Chinese. And the mom has no answer. And the mom only says, I know, I will ask, okay? And then the kid replies, okay, mom. And this is an online video sharing platform. The mother has no answer. She has 26K followers, but then that's how it is. So, and Tibetans are not able to escape. Tibetans have an endless list of thoughts in their mind. Always this list gets longer and longer about what to speak, what to think, what not to speak, what not to think, and always love the CCP. And in 2021, when the CCP celebrated its 100th founding anniversary, children in Tibet Autonomous Region, as they call it, were made to perform this song called I Love CCP, I Wo Zhonghua. And all these children are dressed in Tibetan attire, but they are singing I Love CCP. So, yes, closure of chat groups, monitoring of whatever the space there is online, and also informers in streets, street corners, monasteries, rural villages, borders, everywhere. It's a police state.
Terrible. I'd like to ask the other witnesses, but I think I'm out of time. Is that correct, Mr. Viersen?
Yes, we're at the end of the time here. I just want to thank the witnesses for appearing today and sharing their testimony. We will be putting this all in a report. The information you've given us is very valuable, and so we will look forward to our report that will be coming forward, hopefully fairly soon. You can also submit any of the information that you've mentioned here today, or that you think we need to know. You can submit it to the clerk. Please do that rather quickly, as we're hoping to get that report out as soon as possible. With that, we will be suspending this meeting, and the members of Parliament to please resume on the in-camera link that you have been sent. So with that, I'll suspend the meeting, and I'll see you all back in the in-camera portion of the meeting for the next half hour.
Tujiche, thank you.
Merci tout le monde.